The first frost of the year came quietly without wind or warning. It covered the fields in a thin silver veil, turning every blade of grass into glass, every shadow into something fragile and sharp. The air itself seemed to hum, brittle and bright, and through it, moving low and swift, came a hare. She was small, lean from a long autumn, her fur pale gray with white beginning to show along her paws. Her breath rose in soft clouds, vanishing as quickly as it came. Each hop left a mark in the thin frost, a dotted line across the open field that caught the morning light like a secret written for no one. Beyond the field stood a line of birch and pine, their branches heavy with rime. The trees watched her in silence, their stillness so deep it felt like reverence. The hare paused once, ears high, her body trembling, not from cold, but from the awareness of how wide and quiet the world could be. The land she crossed had once belonged to a farm. The barn was gone now, only its foundation left, half buried under moss. Fences lay broken in the tall grass. Somewhere beneath the snow, an old rusted plow slept. The air still smelled faintly of smoke and hay, and the hare's nose twitched, sorting through the scents. There were new ones, too. Fox, faint but recent. Man, older, mixed with the ghost of oil and wool. She turned toward the north, where the ground dipped into a hollow and the frost thickened. There, the smell of fox was strongest. She moved carefully, each step deliberate. Her heart beat fast and steady. The frost cracked softly under her feet, the sound sharp in the morning quiet. The sun was only a pale coin above the horizon, and the light it gave seemed more memory than warmth. At the edge of the field, a figure stood, a man still as a tree. His coat was long and dark, his breath white in the air. He carried no gun, only a small axe and a bundle of kindling. He watched the hare the way one watches the sky before snow, curious, almost tender. The hare saw him, froze. The world narrowed to a heartbeat. The man did not move. He only lifted his head slightly, meeting her gaze from across the white space between them. For a long moment, time seemed to pause. Even the wind forgot its voice. Then, as if the world itself had exhaled, the hare darted away. She moved like smoke, vanishing between the birch trees, leaving nothing behind but a scattering of frost and silence. The man lowered his eyes, turned toward the woods, and walked on. His boots made a slow rhythm in the snow. Somewhere in the distance, an axe struck wood, echoing through the cold air like a pulse. From the shelter of the trees, the hare watched him go. She could still smell the faint scent of pine and smoke, the human warmth that lingered long after the figure was gone. The frost around her shimmered, and the wind finally began to move again, brushing softly through the trees. The day stretched thin and pale above the frozen land. The hare crossed deeper into the forest, leaving the open field behind. The sun climbed, weak but steady, and high above, the birch and pine stood unmoving, their white branches catching the light, as if still holding their breath for what would come next. By the second week of frost, the air had turned hard and sharp as glass. The ground no longer bent beneath paws or boots. It rang faintly when struck, like frozen wood. Snow had not yet come, but the light itself had gone pale, as though the sun was fading behind a veil. The hare had learned the new map of the land, the patches of dry grass where she could feed, the hollow log where she slept, the narrow ditch where the wind passed more softly. Hunger was a quiet ache that never quite left her, but she was used to that. Hunger was the language of winter. Each morning, she crossed the field again, moving along the same invisible line, where frost had hardened her earlier tracks. The scent of fox lingered on the far side now, fresh and restless. She knew his smell well. Musk, damp fur, hunger like her own but sharper. He was young, unseasoned. She could tell by the clumsiness of his trail. But young foxes were dangerous for that very reason. The hare moved low and quick across the open stretch, then slowed as she neared the birch grove. The trees stood bare and glittering, their bark ghost white against the gray sky. Beneath them, the air carried another scent, human, faint, but new. She stopped, ears high. Somewhere beyond the trees, A man was cutting wood. The sound came steady and distant. Crack. Pause. Crack. The rhythm echoed through the forest, a heartbeat made of effort and cold. She recognized that sound now. It belonged to the same man she had seen before, the one with the dark coat and the still eyes. He was not a hunter. She could smell no metal, no powder on him. But he was part of the landscape now, the way the fox and frost were. She had begun to think of him the same way she thought of trees, large, unpredictable, but necessary. The man worked in silence, his breath white in the air. He had built a small shelter near the edge of the wood, a rough cabin of logs and tar paper, smoke curling from its chimney. Sometimes he left scraps outside, the heel of bread, the rind of cheese. Crows came first, then smaller birds. Once the hare came close enough to smell the food, but not to take it. She trusted her hunger more than the kindness of men. That morning, though, the hunger was stronger. She waited until the axe stopped, until the forest grew quiet again. Then she crept closer. The clearing smelled of pine sap, smoke, and warmth. Strange, intoxicating smells. Near the cabin wall, half buried in frost, lay a crust of bread. She approached it in a zigzag, pausing between steps, nose twitching. The scent was sharp with salt and something she didn't understand, the scent of hands. Inside the cabin, the man sat by the small window, watching. He saw her before she saw him. Her fur shimmered silver in the faint light, every breath visible. She was thin, quick, trembling with life. He didn't move. He simply waited, his hands wrapped around a mug that had long since gone cold. When the hare finally reached the crust, she hesitated only once before taking it. The sound of her teeth breaking the frozen bread was tiny, almost fragile. The man smiled faintly, the first time he had in weeks. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it a smell he recognized instantly. Fox. It came from the far edge of the trees, faint but deliberate. The hare's head snapped up, ears wide. The man stood suddenly, knocking his chair back, and the hare bolted, vanishing into the birches. He stepped outside, scanning the tree line. For a moment he saw movement, low, red, and silent. Then nothing. The woods closed again around the sound of his breath. "Not today," he muttered into the cold. He picked up the axe, rested it against the cabin wall, and crouched near the spot where the bread had been. The hare's tracks were clear. 2 prints close together, then 2 more stretched far apart. Panic and speed. Beyond them, fainter, the neat, cautious steps of the fox. He followed them a few paces into the trees, stopping where the frost deepened. There, the prince turned sharply toward the old river hollow. The hare had escaped, for now. He stood for a long time listening. The forest made no sound, but the faint whisper of branches shifting under ice. Then, slowly, the man turned back toward the cabin. Far beyond the trees, hidden in the hollow where frost never melted, the hare crouched under a tangle of dead fern and snowgrass. Her heart raced, but she was alive. She licked the crumbs from her whiskers, the taste of bread still strange and human on her tongue. Above her, the wind moved gently through the birch tops, as though the trees themselves had sighed in relief. The day dimmed early, as winter days do. When the last light faded, the field turned to silver again, and the world seemed to pause, waiting, listening. The hare slept curled tight, the man sat by his fire, and the fox paced somewhere in between. The trees held their breath once more. By the time the snow came, it came heavy. It began one afternoon as a quiet drift, soft as dust, but by evening it thickened into a curtain that erased the horizon. The forest disappeared behind a gray wall, the sky and the ground becoming one endless blur. Sound faded, even the wind seemed muffled. The world was reduced to breath and whiteness. The hare felt it before it began, the strange pressure in the air, the stillness before the first flakes touched her fur. She had known many winters, but this one carried the kind of silence that meant danger. The cold was deeper than before, the kind that made the world brittle enough to break. By dusk, the field she had crossed all season was gone, beneath a thin white crust. Her old paths were buried, and with them, her sense of direction. The scent of grass, fox, man, everything was gone. She moved in slow hops, pausing often, ears twitching, trying to hear the rhythm of a world she could no longer smell. At the same time, not far from the birch grove, the man fought his own battle against the storm. The roof of his cabin creaked under the weight of snow. He worked quickly, nailing scraps of wood over the window seams, smoke pouring from the chimney. His hands were red and raw. When darkness fell fully, he stepped outside to check the traps. The snow reached almost to his knees, and every step was a small labor. His breath came in short, foggy bursts. Somewhere beyond the trees, a sound carried, a quick, soft rustle, almost too light to hear. He stopped. "Hare," he whispered, as though the name itself were fragile. She was near, though he couldn't see her yet, just a flicker of gray movement against the snow. The hare was moving in circles now, confused, drawn by the faintest trace of something warm, the scent of smoke and bread, the memory of shelter. Then, from the east, another sound, a low, deliberate crunch. The man turned sharply, eyes narrowing. A fox, young, thin, but strong, was moving through the snow, his coat dark against the white. He moved with purpose, nose low, following the same invisible path the hare had left moments ago. The man's pulse quickened. He reached for the axe leaning by the door. He didn't hunt much anymore, he had no stomach for killing. But something about the balance of the world outside the cabin felt wrong, too cruel, too exact. The hare broke from the trees and into the clearing. Her body blurred against the falling snow, her paws barely touching the surface. The fox was only a few paces behind, bounding in long, hungry leaps. The man shouted, the sound raw and sharp in the frozen air. He hurled the axe, not to strike, but to startle. It hit the ground ahead of the fox, biting deep into the crust. The animal skidded, hesitated, and for one suspended heartbeat, all three were frozen. Man, hare, fox, bound together by the same breathless moment. Then the hare darted sideways, vanishing toward the cabin wall, slipping beneath the overhang where the snow hadn't reached. The fox hesitated once more, eyes catching the man's, then turned and fled back into the dark trees. Silence returned slowly, like something exhausted. The man stood still, chest heaving, snow melting on his coat. The hare remained crouched in the shadow, trembling but alive. He knelt beside her shelter, careful not to move too fast. "Easy now," he said softly. His voice carried no command, only warmth. "You're safe." She didn't understand the words, but she felt the tone. Her breathing steadied. He reached toward the door, opened it halfway, and let the light spill across the snow. For a moment, the hare didn't move. Then she took one small hop forward, then another, until she was just inside, where the air was warmer and the smell of fire filled the space. The man closed the door behind them and set his axe aside. The storm howled outside, pressing against the walls like a living thing. Inside, everything glowed gold and still. The hare sat by the hearth, eyes half shut, her fur glistening with melting snow. The man poured water into a tin bowl and placed it near her, then sat on the floor across the room. Neither spoke nor moved much. They simply breathed, the steady rhythm of two lives that had survived the same storm. Outside, the fox circled once, pacing in the snow. He stopped at the edge of the clearing, nose lifted toward the scent of fire and life, and then turned back toward the woods, vanishing into the white. The night went on, and the snow fell without end. The fire burned low, the man's eyelids drooped, and the hare dozed lightly beside the warmth. In the silence, it seemed as though the forest had drawn close, listening. The trees, wrapped in ice and moonlight, stood unmoving. They did not breathe. They only watched, solemn and still, while inside the small cabin, two hearts kept the world from freezing entirely. By the third morning, the snow had stopped. The storm passed like a fever, slowly, leaving silence in its wake. The world outside the cabin was transformed. The trees bent low under the weight of ice. The field was a white ocean, rippled and gleaming under a weak, colorless sun. The air no longer bit, it simply hung, heavy and waiting. Inside, the cabin smelled of smoke and life. The man stirred the ashes in the hearth until the coals glowed red again. The hare sat near the wall, half hidden in shadow, her fur fluffed against the chill. She hadn't left since the storm began. The man watched her as he worked, cutting kindling, mending the handle of his axe, listening to the small, careful sounds she made. She no longer flinched when he moved. Her eyes followed him with wary curiosity, but not fear. "Looks like we both survived," he said softly. His voice was rough from cold and quiet. Not bad for two creatures with nowhere else to go. He reached for a bit of bread from the shelf, broke it, and placed the smaller piece on the floor. He didn't look at her as he did it. The hare waited motionless until he turned back to his work. Then cautiously she hopped forward, sniffed, and took it. The crumbs disappeared quickly. The man smiled faintly. "Guess we understand each other now." For a long while there was only the sound of fire breathing in the stove and the occasional creak of ice shifting on the roof. Outside, sunlight crept through the cracks in the shutters, soft and white, painting the walls in narrow bars of light. Later he opened the door to look at the world beyond. The air smelled clean, like snow, pine, and something faintly metallic. The trees were heavy with ice that glittered in the morning sun. He stepped out, boots crunching in the snow, and looked across the clearing. No fox tracks, no movement. Only silence. Behind him, the hare stood in the doorway. She was small against the vast white, but the way she held herself was steady, unafraid. The wind touched her fur gently, lifting it just enough to shimmer. "You could go," he said quietly. "It's safe now." She twitched her ears but didn't move. Instead, she hopped a few paces into the snow, stopped, and looked back. Her eyes, dark and glassy, caught the light. For a moment, he thought she might vanish again into the woods, become another ghost among the trees. But she didn't. She circled once, then settled near the woodpile, where the sun reached the ground. The man watched her and then went back inside, leaving the door half open. That day passed slowly, filled with small, ordinary motions. He fixed a broken latch, cleaned the stovepipe, and melted snow for water. The hare stayed close. Sometimes she disappeared under the porch or behind the woodpile, but she always returned before dusk. When night came, the temperature dropped again, but not as harshly. The wind moved softly through the birches, carrying the faint scent of thaw. The man sat by the fire, hands wrapped around a mug, his face lit orange by the flames. The hare lay curled on a piece of old cloth near the stove, her body rising and falling in quiet sleep. He watched her for a while, then said almost to himself, "Funny how things find their way to you when you stop expecting them." Outside, the moon rose, a thin silver blade cutting through the clouds. Its light turned the frozen forest into a mirror of stillness. The fox was gone, the tracks buried under new snow. The world for now was calm. In that fragile quiet, the man felt something he hadn't in a long time. Not warmth exactly, but belonging. The cabin no longer felt empty. It sounded alive, faintly breathing. He reached down, almost absently, and brushed a few crumbs toward the sleeping hare. She stirred but didn't wake. The fire snapped softly. Beyond the walls, the forest seemed to listen. The trees, still sheathed in frost, leaned together like old companions. The wind passed among them, low and reverent, as though carrying a secret too delicate to speak aloud. And for the first time that winter, the birches exhaled.